That's glass fusing, and people really didn't do a whole lot of glass fusing. A little bit in the 50s, but basically what would happen is they would walk into a stained glass shop, for example, and there were only like 3 companies making glass in the 50s, Wismac, and Blanco. And they go in and they would find that the reds and the yellows would fuse and the greens and the blues would fuse, but the 2 groups wouldn't fuse together, and so they really didn't have a complete color palette. And other than stretchy beer, pop bottles and so on, there wasn't a lot of glass fusing going on. Klaus Moye took some color bars and melted them together and discovered the ones that worked and the ones that didn't, he didn't use. And he also had a problem with devitrification, which he ground away. And he taught here early, talked a little bit about what glass is. Glass is a non-crystalline structure, and what happens when you heat it up is it becomes more liquid as it gets hotter, okay? And an example of what happens to a crystalline structure is ice. You have ice, you heat it up, and bang, it turns into a liquid just like that. Well, when glass cools, it's so thick that it doesn't have a chance basically to form a crystalline structure. So it's really what they consider a supercool liquid. Now that'll come into play here when I'm talking a little bit more.
Rich, just out of curiosity, how long does it take to cool glass to make a crystal?
Well, quartz crystals?
Any crystal. Could you cool it slow?
Theoretically, yeah, if you could hold it, maybe you could. And some glasses have an opinion that's the major problem. And why most people fail. I get phone calls now and then, and somebody will call up and go, well, it fell apart. And I go, well, did you test the glass? No. And so what I want to talk to you about, see, the type of fusing I do, where I'm sticking one big chunk of color up against another big chunk of color, there's a lot of stresses that can set up. And glass blowing, you can get away with stresses in a little different way. For example, if you flash the inside of the sphere, you've got a thin flash of color, and you've got the spherical shape. You can get away with more stress than the way I'm doing, where you're locking one color up against another that's going around it. And the compatibility for this type of fusing has to be really tight. And so, in a marketing sense, Bullseye got out this stressometer, which is nothing more than a polarizing filters. It's a polarimeter. And this is polarizing film, same thing as in the sunglasses. And it takes all the light waves that come around in all different levels, and it makes them come out in parallel plane. Okay, like pages in a book. And then you have one down here, and you have a light source between them, and when you put the glass between them, and you rotate it until they're crossed at 90 degrees, it turns black. And if you put some glass in there, I guess I'll show you this. This comes into play later. See that? Okay. That actually happens to be a annealing stress, and I'll get to that in a second. And see through an opal. Okay, so they have developed this test that's in the fusing book. See, the reason I'm referring to the book is you can refer back to this, okay? And, where is it? Here it is. Okay? Now the reason that this test is good is because it synthesizes what's going on in a kiln and the process that you'll be involved with. And so the idea is you take a strip of glass and you put a little chip of glass down on it, you put it in the kiln and you fuse it, and it has to be flat so that the glass is trapped, so that it's wrapped around it, and then you look at it under the polarizing light. Now let's see, I have this test, this kit here, is plus or minus 1 of the coefficient of expansion, which is real tight compatibility. So you take, see, there we go. Okay. Now if it's cracked, obviously it's not compatible. Now, once it cracks, it relieves the stress and you don't see it. Okay? So in here, I went up there and got some various spectrum glasses and fused them to spectrum clear. So if you want to fuse glass, you need to do a test like this to know what's going to be compatible. And then you look at it under the polarizing light source. And if you want to use a standard, okay, so you go up there and you pick out one sheet of spectrum and you mark on it, or you bring it down to your table, you're going to use that. See, you really have to have tight control on this. So if you test against one sheet of clear, that next sheet may or may not be compatible just because it's clear. And so you need to test that next sheet too. Okay, for example, even from the same company. For example, Bullseye will say they've got a tank of red, and they're going to ladle out 200 sheets. The first 30 sheets may not be compatible with their clear, and then you get 150 sheets that are, and the bottom 20 sheets may not be, of the same day, of the same tank, of the same run. Okay, so it's pretty tight, and if you want to do large work, you need to have tight control on compatibility.
So then you need to test
everything. And if you're going to be fusing, you need to mark it, and you need to be able to relate this sheet to a specific sheet that's in your rack. I know this sounds real complicated and all that, but if you really want to be successful, you have to do it. Question?
So when you take a sheet, you test it against various things, and you find out that it's compatible with something, not others. That means that you are limited to what you can do with that sheet. Or you simply
You can set up another palette of glass. Now, I personally work with Bullseye glass, okay? Now, Bullseye's taken a lot of the work out of it for us. Okay? What they've done is they have set up in their factory a standard clear glass that they always test their glass against. And they call that their tested compatible clear. And so they label their sheets, okay? And they put the date up here. This happens to be April 22nd, 1988, and the number of the sheet, this is 1116. That's the code number for this color. Okay, this says up here 399, whatever it says, 663 or something. That is the number of the sheet that was labeled that day. They number every single sheet that they ladle, and then they take on every fifth sheet, knock the corner off, and run this test. And the next day they look at it and they throw everything out that doesn't fit their clear. Okay? And then they stick that test compatible sticker. Now, if you buy Bullseye glass that's test compatible, you probably don't need to test. But I recommend that you do test, because there's some other things you're going to learn from the test. You're going to learn about, and I've listed them here. So number one, compatibility. I test all my tested compatible Bullseye. I don't test it necessarily for the compatibility, but I test it for the other things. I want to see if it's going to change colors when I fire it. Okay, here's an example. This is a piece of Bullseye silver 133, and after it was fired, it turned white. So if you're looking for this color, and you're expecting that, and all of a sudden it's white, it can be a real shock. Here's another example. These pieces are glued, siliconed onto this tile, and the other ones are fired. Here's a kind of a tangerine cathedral, and it's struck red cathedral. Okay, so you can get striking and changes in the glass. Here's a white, almost a white, and it's struck pink. Okay, so that's one thing you learn from this test. Okay, another thing you learn is devitrification. Which glasses are going to scum up on you? Okay, now we get back to glass as a non-crystalline structure, okay? Vitrify means glass-like. Okay, no crystals. Devitrification is to grow crystals. And you can grow crystals on the surface of the glass, is usually where it happens when you're fusing. And I'll pass this around, you can look at it, it's all scummy. Now, spectrum is notorious for devitrification. Okay, you can tell that from the test. Now, some bullseyes will devitrify and some won't. And it's nice to know, and I'll get into that in a second. You can get an idea of hardness versus softness. Okay, let's say you've got a black and a white bullseye. The black will probably fuse at about 70 degrees lower than the white. You may want to know that because of how you place the glass. So if you put a piece of black on top, it's going to flow out more than the white. You may want to know that. Also from this test, there is a way that you can tell. Now Walter was asking if one color was compatible to the clear, another color is compatible with the clear. Are they both compatible? Well, it gets a little tricky in that one might be higher in expansion and contraction, one might be lower in expansion and contraction than the clear. There is a way to tell from that test which one's higher or lower than the clear. You take the test and put it on your stressometer and you push on it. And if the halo increases or decreases, you can figure out which one's higher or lower. And if you're interested in that, I can talk to you about it later. It takes a little mental thinking to figure it out, but there is a way to tell that. And you can also tell a relative color density. Some cathedrals may kind of semi-opaque on you, and you may want to know that. So in other words, from doing this test, you're going to know what the glass is going to do after it comes out again.
Is that scumming simply an aesthetic problem?
Yeah, and you may like it or you may not like it. One of the problems is that devitrification can react with the atmosphere and can weather into the glass. If you're going to do an outdoor piece, for example, devitrified glass would probably weather a lot faster than glass that was vitreous.
Doesn't this tend to turn to chalk with time?
It can. It can. It just depends. Okay, so if you're interested about compatibility, I'm doing a real brief over on this, okay? Read the book, talk to me. Now, if you want to do fusing projects here, I suggest the first thing you do is do some tests to determine a palette. And you can look at this. For example, here are two red spectrum cathedrals. One of them cracked out and the other one didn't. Okay, I found just from running this simple test that the red, this green, white, blue, those four glasses in the clear are compatible. So there's some free glass up there. You got 1, 2, 3, 4 colors in the clear to work with. It's free. Okay, now there's one other thing you do on this test is you put a chip of the test itself on the test. And the first thing you do when you look at it is you look at that to see if there's any stress, because if there's stress there, that's from annealing. You haven't annealed it properly, and if there's annealing stress there, it's going to show up in all the tests and throw your whole test off. So you need to do that. I'd be happy to work with you on this. So if you're going to be doing this type of fusing, you want to determine the palette of glass, come to me and I'll help you set this up. And if there are 2 or 3, we can maybe fire a test at the same time.
Is it possible for annealing stress to counteract abnormal stress?
Now that I don't know about, but it's sure going to mess up your test. Okay, now the next thing is how to build a piece and control volume and shape. Okay, here, let's see, can you move that paper? It's right here. What we have here is we have a white bullseye and a green cathedral bullseye, okay? Now, what this is this is the size that's cut before, okay? This is 1 thickness, okay? This is 2 thicknesses, one on top of the other, and this is 3 thicknesses. Now, you'll notice that 2 thicknesses is as close to the original shape, and 3 thicknesses, it spreads out and it's bigger than the original shape. 1 thickness pulls up and is less than the original shape. So let's say you want to make a 12 by 12 inch tile. You need to use 2 thicknesses, or approximately 1/4 of an inch. Glass has an optimum thickness that it wants to be at. Okay, and if it's thicker than 1/4 of an inch and it's held in a kiln, it will push down and expand to get to that optimum thickness. If it's thinner, it will pull up, want to pull up. Okay, So, and also this is an example of hardness versus softness. These are fired at the same time in the kiln. Yeah,
So if I took one thickness of that glass
right.
and I made some kind of, mosaic pattern pieces, would they all pull away from each other?
Yeah. That's the first thing that they want to do is they want to pull up into little nuggets. In fact, that's how you make nuggets for your leaded glass. You just put a piece of glass in there, turn it on. It'll work up to about 3/4 by 3/4 of an inch. It'll pull up into a nugget. After that, it'll start rounding the corners off like these.
So
So what?
like 4 squares.
Put them
How do they
together.
bump against each other? When I open the kiln, there would be 4 separate.
No, they probably stick in spots, but probably you wouldn't get a complete fusion. So what you do is usually, what I do is I take one sheet of clear and put it down and then put my second layer on top, or you can overlap the pieces. Now, one of the problems, if you're just using a single layer, okay, there's a couple other things. One has to do with compatibility also. It's how hard you fuse the pieces and how big your projects are. You can get away with more stress on a small pin than you can on a large tile. I mean, that makes sense. The other thing is you can get away with more stress if you just fuse them together and stick them than you can if you meld them down and really trap them. Okay? So, if you're working with one thickness, and I did when I originally started one thickness, where'd that bullseye go? Okay. And like Henry was talking about technique, mistakes become techniques. Well, here's a piece that I did early, and this was one sheet of black. Okay, this was my second layer, was the green. And what happened is the black wanted to pull up to those two thicknesses. The hotter I got, the more it wanted to pull up. And so what it did is it started pulling up. Now that piece of glass had sealed down against the kiln shelf and trapped air in there. So as soon as it started thinning out, the air just went right up through it and blew a bubble about that high. Okay, then that became a technique for me because I go in there and pop them. And then I figured out how I could make them sort of happen where I wanted them by having a single layer of black, which was real soft, putting second layers around, and the spots that were single layers would just blow bubbles exactly almost where I wanted them. So that became a technique in the whole series. So that's going to become a problem when you build a piece. If you full fuse a piece, now there's different levels of fusion. Okay, there's a fuse to stick where it's just stuck together and the edges are barely rounded. Then there's a semi-fuse where it goes down even more, and then there's a full fuse where it's totally flat like this. Okay, most of my work is full fuse, and when you get up to those temperatures, it's softer. And if you don't build a piece right, what's going to happen is air bubbles are going to come up through it and they're going to blow these huge holes. Now these holes I backed with titanium and made them real fancy, but those are holes all the way through the glass. So there are ways to deal with that. One, I work with one solid piece of clear and second layers and maybe third layers on top of that. Now if you take that on a kiln shelf and you put little chips of glass around the edge, so if I've got clear, I'm going to full fuse, I'll put little 1/8 inch by 1/8 inch chips about every 6 inches all the way around my piece. It holds that glass up off the shelf about 1/8 of an inch, so that when it slumps, the center will go down and it will first, and it'll push the air off the shelf so you don't get any air trapped under there, and that way you can fuse large pieces without blowing holes in it. Anything bigger than about like that, when you go to full fuse, you're chancing to blow a big hole in it. Another way to do it is to work with 3 or 4 thicknesses. You've got so much weight it won't blow up. But when you've got 3 or 4 thicknesses, it's going to want to spread out. So you need to put a dam around your piece. Okay, you can dam your piece with bricks or a metal or whatever, as long as the metal isn't going to trap the glass. See, it's got to be in sections. Usually I'll put fiber paper in there as a cushion. Then you have to come back and grind and polish the edge. So you can fuse thicker, but just to fuse on its own, to stay near the shape you want, 2 thicknesses with maybe third layers. Now there's another way. Okay, so there's the chip method. You can fuse it on fiber paper. I'll get a piece of fiber paper out of the store. So.
Is this going to be special? Yeah, it's for the school. I'm just taking it.
Okay, this is fiber paper. They sell it in this 1 inch of fiber blanket will shrink down with coil silk at about 1/4 of an inch. So it takes a lot of fiber. That's why it's expensive. Okay, so that's just a side note on fiber, yeah.
I noticed this usually, I've had used
The
this
lens
fiber
is
for
really
that
helping.
cake, like
It's
center stuff. You
Oh,
just
I
put it
see.
in a kiln, with the piece of glass on it, the glue burns out into the glass. Do you normally burn out the glue on the wax paper first?
Okay, no, I don't. And what happens is there is an organic binder in here. I think it's real nasty to breathe. So if you're burning this out in your studio, you should have ventilation. In fact, you should have ventilation when you fire kiln. Anyhow, at 1,000 degrees it'll turn black. At 1,100 it'll turn white, and the organic's burned out of it. Okay, and no, it's never stuck to my glass.
No, it doesn't stick, it leaves like.
Kind of a milky haze.
Yeah,
What sort of glue or?
no, it's in the fiber wax paper.
I'd say it's
itself.
probably the brand. I don't usually do it. This was fired on it. You know, it's probably the brand you have. If that's a problem, you can pre-fire it. Once this stuff is fired, it becomes very friable and lots of fibers get in the air. If you're cutting and working with this a lot, well, before it's fired, I would definitely wear a respirator. If you're even thinking about dealing with it after it's fired, I would surely wear a respirator. So take caution with that. Okay. So that briefly covers the controlling volume and shape. Annealing. Well, Mr. Marioni says that there are a lot of different theories on annealing. They're like bread recipes. Everybody has one. So you can ask anybody about annealing. They're all going to tell you different stories. So now it's time for me to tell you my story about annealing. Okay. Now, annealing, you want to reduce the stress in the glass to an acceptable level by slow cooling or soaking as the glass passes from a plastic to a rigid state. Okay, now I could get real technical about it, but I have this other little story that's kind of fun. As you heat glass up, it becomes more flowing, more liquid. And it gets softer, it moves more. And as you cool it down, it becomes thicker and more viscous. Well, at a certain point, it goes from a plastic state where it's moving to a solid state, okay? And it's not a just specific, 920 degrees, but, I mean, there's lots of things. There's a lot about it. Okay, so, so as we're cooling the glass down, there comes a time where it's economically, it takes longer to soak the glass at that point. So you can anneal glass at a lower temperature, it just takes a longer time. So there's one point roughly where it's the most economically time-wise to soak your glass. And what you want to do is you want to soak the glass at a point where it goes from the plastic to the rigid state. And so let's pretend that we're inside of a piece of that thickness of bullseye, and the cement floor is the shelf, and the rafters are up there at the top layer of the glass, and we're inside the glass. So the glass is cooling down. It's cooling down by letting the heat off through the top surface of the glass. And for bullseye, it hits 920 degrees. And what happens is, imagine that top surface all of a sudden becomes rigid. Well, we're still down here in the glass, and we're at a higher temperature, and that locks, and we're still shrinking, because we're still cooling and we're shrinking, and we're pulling on it, okay? And all of a sudden we hit 920 and we lock. Well, the amount of difference of pull between when that area locks and the inside locks is the amount of stress that's left in the glass. So what you want to do near the annealing point is soak it so that the top surface and the inside of the glass and the bottom of the glass relatively slide through that point where it goes from plastic to rigid at the same time. Okay, that is sort of my idea of annealing. And for bullseye, it's roughly at 920 degrees. Now, in here is a chart that Ruth and I put together a few years ago that is a firing schedule. And we based this on a 16 by 16 inch shell, 2 thicknesses of bullseye, 1 solid piece, and second layers on top. This is the fusing curve, and over here is the slumping curve. Now you have to go a little slower on slumping because all of a sudden that piece, those pieces that were smaller, have all of a sudden fused together and become one big piece. Okay, now glass doesn't conduct heat very well. It takes a long time to transfer the heat through to the inside. That's why it takes so long to anneal, to get the heat to even out. It takes time. Now, if we just put that in a kiln, turned it on high, it would explode. The reason is the top surface of glass starts expanding as it heats up, and the inside's just moving like that. Okay, so you have to take the glass up at a relatively slow rise, slow enough so that the outside surface and the inside will expand at roughly the same rate. If one's moving more than the other, there's a certain point where the stresses build up and it'll crack the glass. That's called thermal shock. So thermal shock zone is roughly 300 to 800 degrees. It's really the critical point, up and down. So you need to fire your kiln fairly slowly, and with a top firing kiln, I figured, 2 hours to 1,000